In 1932, during the third season of excavations at Tel Asmar, ancient Eshnunna, Henri Frankfort's team uncovered a sequence of temple foundations extending 7 meters below the modern surface. Each layer represented a reconstruction. Temple 7 built atop Temple 6, which sat upon Temple 5, descending through architectural strata spanning nearly 2,000 years. The temples grew larger with each iteration, their footprints expanding, their mud brick platforms rising higher. But at the transition between Temple 4 and Temple 3, dated to approximately 2600 BCE, something changed. The new temple was smaller, not degraded, deliberately reduced in scale. The foundation trenches were precisely cut, the brickwork formal and methodical, but the sacred enclosure contracted by nearly 40%. The inner sanctuary, which in earlier phases had occupied the entire rear third of the structure, was divided. A new wall appeared, separating the sanctuary from a rear chamber that contained no altar, no offering platform, no cultic furniture. Just empty floor space, carefully plastered, maintained across subsequent rebuilds, but never used. The archaeologists called it the reserve chamber. The Sumerian builders left no dedicatory inscription explaining its purpose. They simply built it, and then built around it, as if waiting for something to return. This architectural absence appears across multiple sites during the same period. At Kafaja, the Sin temple shows an identical rear chamber. At Nippur, the Inanna temple complex includes 3 such spaces, all post-dating 2600 BCE, all unoccupied. The pattern is not universal. Some temples retain their original configurations, but where it occurs with precision. These were not storage rooms. Storage chambers from the same period are identifiable by their threshold wear, by the residue of grain or oil, by the density of broken pottery. The reserve chambers contain none of this. Their floors remain clean, their corners undisturbed. They were spaces held open. The cuneiform administrative texts from these temples during this period record a subtle but consistent shift in language. Earlier tablets, those predating the architectural changes, describe offerings as brought before the deity. The verb is maharu, to receive, to accept. The god is the grammatical subject. The offering is the object. The human is the agent, but the action's completion depends on divine reception. After approximately 2600 BCE, the verb shifts. Offerings are now placed in the temple of the deity. The verb becomes shakanu, to place, to set down. The god remains present in the locative case. The place is still sacred, but the god is no longer the one who receives. The offering is placed, and the record closes. Whether the god accepted it, whether the god was present to accept it, is no longer part of the scribal account. This is not abandonment in the sense of ruin or cessation. The temples continued to function, the offerings continued, the priesthoods expanded in fact. Payroll lists from Lagash and Umma during the early dynastic III period show more temple personnel than in earlier phases, not fewer. But the nature of the transaction had changed. What had once been an exchange, offerings given, divine favour received, became a deposit. The gods were still honoured, still named, still invoked. But the texts began to describe a world in which humans acted, and the gods were addressed. Not absent, but not responsive in the older sense. The grammar itself shifted from reciprocal to unidirectional. The Sumerian king list, compiled later but drawing on earlier sources, encodes this transition in its structure. The antediluvian section describes kingship as lowered from heaven. The Akkadian phrase is Ana Shame Shuklulu, literally made to descend from the sky. Kingship is something given, something transferred from divine to human hands by deliberate action. The subject is implicit but clear. The gods granted it. Then the flood. Then the second section, beginning with Kish. The language changes. Kingship is now Ina Kishi Banu, built in Kish, or Ina Uruk Kusu Shaknu, the throne established in Uruk. The verb of divine granting is gone. Kingship is now something humans establish, something constructed rather than received. The list does not explain this shift. It records it as fact, as chronology, but offers no narrative of why the grammar of authority changed. The cities themselves show no collapse during this period. Uruk continued to grow. Ur expanded its temple complexes and residential quarters. Lagash developed intensive irrigation networks. The material record is one of increasing organizational complexity, not decline. Yet within that growth, something in the textual record quietly shifts. The earliest royal inscriptions, those of Enmebaragesi of Kish or Meskiagasha of Uruk, describe the king as chosen by a deity. By the time of Eonatum of Lagash, 2 centuries later, the king is beloved of the deity, a passive descriptor, an attribute of the king rather than an active selection by the god. By Urukagina, the language becomes even more distant. The king acts in accordance with the word of the god, as if following a prior instruction, an inherited command, rather than receiving direct guidance. The gods are still named, they are still the source of legitimation, but they are no longer the ones who choose, they are the ones who, at some earlier time, chose. What changed between the early 3rd millennium and the mid-3rd millennium was not the presence of the gods in belief, but their presence in the active grammar of governance. The offerings still flowed into the temples, the hymns still praised the divine names, the legal oaths still invoked Utu and Nana as witnesses, but the administrative machinery of the state began to describe itself as self-operating. The scribes who filed the grain receipts no longer wrote that the gods provided the harvest, they wrote that the fields of the temple produced it, that the labourers brought it in, that the storehouse received it. The gods remained owners, but the operations were human. This was not a theological revolution. There is no text that declares the gods absent, no reform that removes them from the pantheon, no proclamation of a new order. The shift occurs in granular details, in the passive reorganization of formulaic phrases, in the small architectural choices made by builders who left no explanation. It is visible only in aggregate, across decades, across many sites, in the slow drift of institutional language. The reserve chambers remained empty. The temples were rebuilt over them, again and again, preserving the space. No later text explains why. No foundation deposit describes their purpose. They were simply maintained, generation after generation, as if the possibility of return had been built into the structure itself. Not as ruins awaiting restoration, but as spaces awaiting reoccupation. The difference is subtle but essential. A ruin is evidence of departure. An empty room, carefully preserved, is evidence of expectation. But expectation of what? The texts do not say. They record the grain, the sheep, the bricks, the labourers. They invoke the gods as witnesses and as owners, but they do not record the gods as actors. Somewhere in the centuries after 2600 BCE, the language of Sumerian record-keeping began to describe a world in which the gods had transferred their authority, but not their presence, in which the machinery of civilization continued under divine sanction, but without divine operation. The scribes did not mourn this, they simply recorded it. They filed the tablets in the archives as they always had. They wrote the year names and the king names and the field names with the same precision. But the verbs had changed. The structure of the sentence had shifted, and in that shift, something about the nature of the world had been quietly redefined. What the tablets describe is not the end of the gods, but the beginning of a world in which the gods were no longer necessary for the sentence to be complete. The humans could act, the record could close, the system could function. And the gods, still named, still honoured, had become something other than rulers. The question is whether the Sumerians themselves understood this as loss, as inheritance, or as something else entirely. Tablet BM 106004, excavated from Lhasa in 1923 and catalogued in the British Museum's Sipar archive, is a balanced account from the reign of Rim Sin I, approximately 1822 BCE. It records a single month's income and expenditure for a minor temple complex dedicated to Utu. 63 lines of cuneiform list barley received from temple fields, distributed as rations to singers, brewers, millers, gate watchers, and scribes. Each entry follows perfect protocol: name, profession, amount in sila, witnessed by the overseer. At line 59, the scribe begins the closing formula. He writes the word for total, napkaru, then the sum of received barley, 4,200 sila. Then, on line 60, the word expenditure, shitu, and the sum distributed, 4,190 sila. Then line 61, surplus, atru, and the number 10. The account should balance. The received minus the expended should equal the surplus. But 4,200 minus 4,190 equals 10. The scribe has written it correctly. The numbers are not wrong, but the balance is impossible. 10 sila cannot be the surplus when the expenditure listed in the preceding lines includes distributions that, when individually summed, total 4,200 exactly. The scribe has recorded every distribution, tallied them, then claimed a surplus that cannot exist within his own numbers. The tablet was fired, sealed, and filed as accurate. No correction tablet follows it. No marginal note flags the error. The impossible account became part of the official archive. This is not an isolated scribal mistake. The same pattern appears in tablets from from Umma, from Girsu. Accounts that internally contradict, that record distributions exceeding receipts, that claim balances that do not match their own sums, yet are filed as if correct. Not frequently, the vast majority of accounts are arithmetically sound, but consistently enough that the pattern is detectable. In 1952, Tom B. Jones, analysing UR3 administrative texts, noted that certain categories of expenditure, particularly those involving offerings to deities, were sometimes listed twice, once in the main account and once in a subcategory. When both were included in the final tally, the numbers doubled. But the scribes did not always mark which version to count. Some tablets summed both, others summed only one. A few summed both, then subtracted one back out in a final line labelled "deduction for offering recorded above." The system was trying to account for something, but the method was inconsistent. The question is not whether the scribes knew arithmetic. The evidence is overwhelming that they did. Multiplication tables, metrological conversion lists, geometric area calculations, all exist in profusion from the same period, all executed flawlessly. The scribes who filed these accounts were trained in numerical literacy. They were not making errors. They were recording something else. One possibility is that the accounts were symbolic rather than operational, that the numbers represented ideal distributions, what should have been given, rather than actual disbursements, that the act of recording fulfilled a ritual obligation separate from physical reality. But this does not explain why most accounts are precise, or why some accounts include detailed notes about shortfalls, about deferred payments, about quantities received but not yet processed. The system distinguishes between ideal and actual when it needs to. The contradictory accounts are not marked as symbolic. They are filed alongside the functional ones in the same archives, using the same terminology. Another possibility is that the contradictions reflect dual accounting, that some distributions were recorded in divine accounts and in human accounts simultaneously, and the scribes were attempting to track both. That when barley was given as an offering, it left the human ledger but remained in the divine ledger, and both had to be recorded. But this would require the surplus to appear in one ledger and the deficit in the other. Instead, the surplus appears in the same account that records the impossible distribution. The ledger does not split. It contradicts itself internally. A third possibility is that the scribes were recording transactions that no longer occurred but were still required to be documented. That certain offerings, certain distributions, were textual obligations that persisted even when the physical actions ceased. That the account recorded what was owed, not what was done, and the surplus represented the gap. This would explain why the numbers do not reconcile. They were never meant to. The record was not tracking goods, it was tracking duty. But if that is the case, the nature of the archive changes. It is no longer a record of administration. It becomes a record of expectation, of continuity maintained on clay when it could not be maintained in action. The tablets describe a system in which the protocols continued even when the underlying transactions became unclear. The scribes still wrote the offerings as given. The accounts still closed with summations. The seals still marked the documents as official. But somewhere in the process, the connection between the number and the thing it counted had become ambiguous. This ambiguity is most visible in the so-called balanced-unbalanced accounts from Drahem, the livestock administrative centre south of Nippur. Thousands of tablets from this site, spanning the Ur-3 period, record the flow of sheep and goats into and out of the centralised herds. Most accounts are models of precision, animals received from provincial shepherds, animals dispersed to temples for sacrifice, animals sent to royal banquets, animals dead from disease, animals born in the state flocks. Each category tracked, each number justified. Then, periodically, a tablet records a balanced loss. Animals are listed as received, then listed as lost, not dead, not stolen, not sacrificed, but halku, gone. The number of animals gone exactly equals the number received. The account balances at 0. The scribe writes, "account balanced" at the bottom. But nothing has been accomplished. The animals arrived and vanished, and this is filed as a completed transaction. One interpretation, proposed by Piotr Steinkeller, is that these tablets record animals transferred to divine ownership, removed from human accounting because they now belong to the gods. The loss was an administrative reclassification, not a physical disappearance. The animals still existed, still grazed in the fields, but they were no longer counted in the human system. They had been given, and the giving was complete. The account balanced because nothing remained in the human ledger to track. But if this is correct, the implications are subtle and strange. The system was maintaining two parallel realities, one in which the animals existed and were managed, and one in which they had been removed from management by transfer to a category beyond accounting. The scribes recorded the transfer, closed the account, and continued. The animals themselves, where they went, how they were used, whether they were ever sacrificed, became irrelevant to the record. The record tracked the boundary between human and divine administration, not the animals. This suggests that the administrative system was not failing, it was adapting to a new function. The tablets were no longer purely economic instruments. They had become records of obligation fulfilled, of ritual duty discharged, of a system maintaining continuity with a divine order, even as the operational details of that order became opaque. The numbers did not need to reconcile in material terms because they were reconciling something else. Perhaps the expectation of divine oversight, perhaps the memory of a time when the accounts were checked by more than human auditors. The archive at Gersu contains a sequence of grain distribution lists from the reign of Shulgi that show this transition in process. The earliest lists describe grain brought before Nanshe, the city's goddess, with the verb makaru, to receive. The middle lists describe grain given to Nanshe, with the verb nadanu, to give. The latest lists describe grain placed in the storehouse of Nanshe, with the verb shakanu, to place. The goddess is still the recipient in the grammatical structure, but the action shifts from her receiving to humans giving to humans placing. The final step removes the goddess from the action entirely. The grain is placed in her storehouse, but she is not the one who takes it. The storehouse becomes the endpoint. The grain arrives, is recorded, and the account closes. What this implies is that the system was slowly replacing divine reception with human documentation. The record itself became the act of completion. The tablet, once a tool to track transactions overseen by gods, became the transaction. Filing the account fulfilled the obligation. the numbers written in clay substituted for the exchange that the numbers were meant to represent. The archive became a kind of temple, and the act of writing became a kind of offering. But this raises a question the tablets cannot answer. Did the scribes understand this substitution? Did they file these contradictory accounts knowing that the numbers no longer tracked material reality? Or did they believe the accounts were accurate in some other sense? The tablets preserve no commentary, no scribal notes expressing doubt or confusion. The work continues, year after year, with the same formal precision. Either the scribes did not notice, or they noticed and did not consider it a problem. Either possibility suggests that the purpose of the record had shifted in ways the record itself does not explain. The tablets after divine withdrawal do not describe collapse or confusion. They describe adjustment. The system adapted. The language changed. The accounts redefined themselves. But in adapting, they began to record something other than what they appeared to record. The clay still listed barley and sheep and silver, but what it was counting, whether goods or obligations or memory, became less certain with every generation of scribes. The tablets still exist, filed in the ancient archives, the numbers still legible. But what those numbers meant to the people who wrote them, and whether those meanings remain stable across the centuries, is something the clay does not preserve. The Sumerian king list, preserved in multiple recensions across sites from Nippur to Isin to Lhasa, is not a single text but a tradition, a framework copied, edited and extended across more than 5 centuries. The most complete version, known as the Weld Blundell Prism and housed in the Ashmolean Museum, was inscribed around 1827 BCE during the reign of Sin-Magir of Isin. It stands 20 centimeters tall, a 4-sided clay prism covered in 8 columns of cuneiform, recording kingship from its divine origins to the scribe's own present. The text begins with the phrase, "After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu." 5 cities receive kingship before the flood: Eridu, Bad Tibera, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak. 8 kings rule across these cities, their reigns measured in tens of thousands of years. Alulim of Eridu rules for 28,800 years. Enmenluana of Bad Tibera rules for 43,200 years. The numbers follow sexagesimal multiples of 3,600, the Sumerian Shah, a numerical term that also means totality or universe. These are not reigns, they are epochs. The text is not describing human rulers, it is describing something else, encoded in the language of kingship, but operating on a scale beyond human life. Then the flood. 1 line. The flood swept over. Then, after the flood had swept over and the kingship had descended from heaven a second time, the kingship was in Kish. The phrase Ana Shame Shuklulu, descended from heaven, appears twice, once before the flood, once after. Kingship is given, then erased, then given again. But after the flood, the reigns contract. The first king of the post-Diluvian period, Gower of Kish, rules for 1,200 years, still immense, but no longer a Shah. The second king, Gula, rules for 960 years. By the 6th king, the reigns drop below 1,000. By the 10th king, below 500. By the 17th dynasty, the reigns are measured in ordinary human lifetimes. Enmebarajesi of Kish, the first king whose existence is archaeologically attested through contemporary inscriptions, is listed as ruling for 900 years. But his son, Aga of Kish, also attested in early sources, is listed as ruling for 625 years. The transition from mythic to historical time is not sudden. It decays gradually, king by king, as if the text is moving through a long twilight between divine time and human time. But the more significant change is not in the numbers, it is in the language of legitimation. Before the flood, kings are not described, they are listed. Name, city, reign length. No titles, no epithets, no accomplishments. The antediluvian kings simply are. After the flood, the first dynasties continue this pattern: name, city, reign. Then, beginning with the first dynasty of Uruk, something shifts. Meskiagasha is described as son of Utu, the sun god. His son, Enmerkar, is credited with building Uruk. Lugalbanda, the next king, is called the shepherd. Dumuzi is called the fisherman. The kings acquire attributes, professions, relationships to gods. They are still listed in the same formulaic structure, but they are beginning to be characterized. They are becoming individuals rather than names in a sequence. By the time the list reaches Gilgamesh, the text has shifted entirely. Gilgamesh is not just listed, he is described as whose father was a phantom, a high priest of Kulaba, and his reign is noted as 126 years, a number far closer to possible exaggeration of a human life than to mythic time. The next kings are given reigns of 30, 36, 25 years, well within normal human spans. The language of the list has changed from record to narrative. The kings are no longer components of a structure lowered from heaven. They are men who ruled cities. Yet the list does not explain this transition. It does not mark the moment when divine kingship became human kingship. It does not say, "Here the gods withdrew and men took up the throne." It simply continues. The formula persists: name, city, reign. But the meaning of the formula changes beneath it. The list moves from myth to history without acknowledging the boundary. The implications of this are difficult to parse. If the list is read as a continuous record, then kingship after the flood is still described as descended from heaven. The gods still grant it. But the kings who receive it are mortal. They die within human lifespans. They build cities, they wage wars, they are succeeded by their sons. The mechanism of divine selection is still invoked, but the results are human. This suggests that kingship, after the flood, became something transferred rather than embodied. The gods no longer ruled through the kings. They authorized the kings, then withdrew. The king was no longer divine, he was divinely appointed. But even this description overstates what the text says. The king list does not describe appointments. It does not depict gods choosing kings. It simply states that kingship descended and then lists who held it. The causality is implied, but not narrated. The reader is left to infer that the gods selected these kings, but the text does not show the selection. It shows only the result. By the III period, when many recensions of the king list were compiled, the language of royal legitimation in contemporary inscriptions had shifted further. Kings no longer claimed to be chosen by gods, they claimed to be beloved of gods, or acting in accordance with divine will, or restoring temples to fulfill old decrees. The relationship had become retrospective. The gods had, at some point in the past, established the order of things. The king's role was to maintain that order, to repair what had fallen into disrepair, to remember what had been forgotten. This is the language of inheritance, not of appointment. The king ruled because the gods had once established that kings should rule, but the gods were no longer involved in the transfer of power. The king list encodes this in its structure. After the early dynastic period, the list begins to include overlapping dynasties. The third dynasty of Uruk is listed after the first dynasty of Ur, but archaeological evidence shows they were contemporaneous. The list presents them sequentially, as if kingship passed from city to city in orderly succession. But the historical reality was fragmented. Multiple kings claimed authority at the same time. The list imposes order retrospectively, creating the appearance of continuous divine sanction where the evidence suggests competition and fragmentation. This editorial choice reveals something about the purpose of the text. The king list was not a chronicle, it was an argument. It claimed that kingship was singular, divinely sanctioned, and continuous from the beginning of time to the present. It claimed that despite wars, despite rival dynasties, despite the flood itself, the institution of kingship persisted because it had been established by the gods. The list was a theological assertion disguised as historical record. But if kingship was divinely established, why did it require such elaborate justification? Why did the scribes need to construct a lineage stretching back to Eridu, to pre-flood times, to the moment when kingship first descended? The very effort suggests anxiety. The list argues for continuity so insistently because continuity was not self-evident. The kings of Isin, who commissioned the most complete recensions of the king list, were not the successors of They claimed to be, but their claim was contested. The list provided a textual foundation for a political authority that was, in practice, unstable. This is the paradox of the king list. It describes kingship as eternal and divinely granted, but its existence as a text proves that this claim needed to be made. If kingship truly descended from heaven, if the gods truly selected each ruler, then no list would be necessary. The authority would be self-evident. The fact that the list was compiled, copied, and edited suggests that the connection between divine will and human rule had become something that required documentation. The gods no longer spoke directly. Their will had to be inferred from the past, reconstructed from old records, argued through genealogies and successions that linked the present king to an ancient, unbroken chain. But the chain was broken. The flood broke it. The transition from mythic reigns to human reigns marked a rupture, not a continuity. The list acknowledged this by repeating the phrase, "The kingship descended from heaven," after the flood. Kingship had to be given twice because it had been interrupted. The first dispensation ended, the second began. And if kingship could be interrupted once, it could be interrupted again. The list does not say this, but the structure implies it. The gods gave kingship. The gods could, presumably, take it away, or simply stop giving it. The list ends in the scribe's present, with the reigning king. But it does not say that kingship will continue. It records that kingship has continued up to this point. The future is not included. The late Babylonian king list, compiled over a millennium later, extends the tradition. It lists kings from the first dynasty of Babylon through the Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian periods up to the Persian conquest. But it does not include the antediluvian kings. It does not include the phrase, "descended from heaven." It begins with human rulers, ruling human lifespans, with no claim to divine origins. The tradition has collapsed. Kingship is no longer something given by gods. It is simply something that exists, that passes from one ruler to the next, recorded not because it is sacred, but because it is the structure of political authority. The gods are gone from the list. What remains is bureaucracy. But the question the Sumerian king list poses is not whether the gods existed. It is whether the Sumerians believed that divine legitimation was still operative, or whether they understood it as a past event whose effects persisted in institutional form. Did the kings of Isin believe the gods chose them, or did they believe the gods had once chosen the institution of kingship, and they were inheriting that institution? The list does not answer this. It records that kingship descended from heaven, and then it lists kings. The mechanism is asserted, but the ongoing operation of that mechanism is not described. The kings rule, the gods are named. The connection between the two is assumed, but not demonstrated. What this leaves is a record of authority that claims continuity with the divine, but operates in entirely human terms. The kings are mortal. They die. They are replaced. The gods do not intervene. The list acknowledges this by shifting from mythic to historical time, but it does not explain the shift. It treats the transition as natural, as if the movement from 28,800-year reigns to 30-year reigns was simply the way time flows. But it is not. It is the record of a change in the nature of power, a change the text encodes but does not interpret. The final question, then, is whether the Sumerian scribes who compiled the king list understood what they were recording. Did they see the transition from divine to human time as a loss, or as the proper order of things? Did they believe the gods had withdrawn, or that the gods had simply finished the work of establishing kingship and left it to humans to maintain. The list does not say. It records, it asserts continuity, but whether that continuity was experienced as presence or as memory is something the text does not preserve. The kings continued to rule, the list continued to grow, but the gods, after the flood, after the shortening of the reigns, after the shift from epoch to year, the gods remained in the text, but their actions ceased. And the scribes wrote this down as if it were simply the way things were. In 1850, Hormuzd Rassam, excavating the ruins of Esarhaddon's southwest palace at Nineveh, discovered a large administrative archive in a series of rooms adjacent to the throne room. Among the tablets was one, later catalogued as K3500, that recorded construction projects undertaken across multiple cities during the reign of Sargon II, king of Assyria, from 722 to 705 BCE. The tablet is a summary document, listing cities, projects, materials, and labour forces. Most entries follow standard format: city name, project name, typically wall or gate or temple, material quantity, completion status. But entry 17 lists the city of Dur-Sharrukin, Sargon's newly built capital northeast of Nineveh. It describes the construction of the city's central ziggurat, a stepped temple platform dedicated to the god Ashur. The entry lists 18 million bricks, 4,200 labourers, 11 years of construction. Then, in the final line, it states, "Foundation laid, platform raised, no temple built." The ziggurat was completed, the platform stood, the stairs were installed, but the sanctuary that should have crowned the structure was never constructed. Sargon died before the temple was finished. His son, Sennacherib, abandoned Dur-Sharrukin and moved the capital to Nineveh. The platform remained, the city was largely deserted. The ziggurat stood incomplete for centuries, its upper surface empty, its purpose unfulfilled. This is not an isolated case. Across Mesopotamia, from the early dynastic period through the Neo-Babylonian era, temple platforms were built, maintained and rebuilt, even when the temples themselves were absent or inactive. The Anu ziggurat at Uruk, excavated in the 1920s and 1930s by the German Oriental Society, shows 17 distinct construction phases spanning nearly 3,000 years. Each phase rebuilt the platform, raising it higher, expanding its footprint, reinforcing its mud brick core with baked brick revetments. But several phases show no corresponding temple structure atop the platform. The uppermost surface in those phases was simply paved. No walls, no sanctuary, no altar, just a flat, elevated space, carefully plastered, maintained, and left empty. The same pattern appears at Ur. The ziggurat of Nanna, the moon god, was built by Ur-Nammu around 2100 BCE and restored by Nabonidus in the 6th century BCE. Between these two major reconstructions, the structure was repaired multiple times. Archaeological evidence from the core shows that the mud brick interior was reinforced during the Isin-Lhasa period, and again during the Kassite period, long after the Ur-III state that built the original ziggurat had collapsed. But during the Isin-Lhasa repairs, the temple atop the platform, the Gipar, the residence of the moon god, was not rebuilt. The platform was stabilized, the staircases were maintained, but the upper structure remained absent. The ziggurat was preserved as infrastructure for a building that did not exist. Why maintain a platform for a temple that was not there? One explanation is practical. The ziggurats were massive investments of labour and materials, and allowing them to collapse would require even more labour to clear the ruins and rebuild from ground level. Maintenance was cheaper than reconstruction. The platforms were preserved as civic infrastructure, as monumental architecture that defined the city's identity, regardless of the temple's status. This is plausible, and the administrative texts from Ur and Uruk do describe platform maintenance as a regular budgeted expense, listed alongside wall repairs and canal dredging. But this does not explain why the platforms were not repurposed. If the temple was gone, if the god was no longer thought to dwell there, the platform could have been used for storage, for administrative buildings, for royal residences. The elevated space would have been valuable, high ground in the flat alluvial plain, with commanding views, with symbolic prestige. Yet the platforms were left empty. Not abandoned, empty. The distinction is important. Abandoned structures decay. These structures were maintained, the surfaces were replastered, the stairs were repaired, but nothing was built on them. The cuneiform term for the uppermost section of a ziggurat is kigal, literally great place or great platform. The term appears in temple administrative texts, in royal inscriptions, and in ritual texts. In the earliest references, the kigal is described as the dwelling of the god, the place where the divine image resides, where offerings are brought, where the god is present. By the mid-2nd millennium BCE, the term remains, but the ritual texts begin to describe the kigal not as a dwelling, but as a station. The Akkadian term is madzazu, a place of standing, of waiting. The god is not said to reside there. The god is said to stand there, or to be stationed there. The language shifts from habitation to presence, from residence to visitation. This shift is subtle, but it recurs across multiple texts. A ritual tablet from the Seleucid period, found at Uruk and now in the British Museum, describes a festival in which the statue of Anu is carried from the temple below up to the kigal of the ziggurat. The text specifies that the statue is placed on the platform, offerings are made, hymns are sung, and then the statue is carried back down. The platform is not where the god lives, it is where the god is brought, temporarily, for a specific ritual. The ziggurat has become a stage, a location for an event, rather than a residence. But if the ziggurats were stages, they were stages that often stood empty. The ritual texts describe festivals, annual events, calendrically fixed, involving processions and offerings. But these events occurred once a year, sometimes less. The rest of the time, the platforms were vacant. The maintenance continued. The structures were repaired after every rainstorm, every windstorm, every season of heat that cracked the mud brick. Labourers hauled new bricks up the long staircases, replastered the surfaces, cleared the drainage channels, all to preserve a space that was used, at most, a few days per year. The economic records make this even stranger. A tablet from Larsa, dated to the reign of Rim-Sin, lists annual maintenance costs for the city's ziggurat. The document itemizes bricks, bitumen, labour days, and supervisory fees. The total cost is equivalent to the annual barley ration for approximately 300 workers. This is not trivial. It is a significant allocation of resources. But the tablet also notes that the Temple of Utu, the structure that should sit atop the platform, is not standing. The platform is being maintained for a temple that does not exist, at considerable expense, with no indication of when or whether the temple will be rebuilt. This is not irrational in a strictly economic sense. The platform, if allowed to collapse, would be far more expensive to replace. Maintenance defers the larger cost. But it also locks the city into a perpetual obligation. Every year, resources flow into preserving a structure whose purpose is inactive. The city could choose to stop. The platform could be allowed to erode. Within a few generations, it would be a ruin, and the obligation would end. But the cities did not stop. They continued. Across centuries, across political upheavals, across changes in dynasty and language and cult, the platforms were maintained. The question is what this maintenance signified. Was it religious duty? A belief that the gods would return, that the temples would be rebuilt, that the platforms must be ready? Was it cultural identity? A refusal to let the most visible symbols of the city's past collapse, regardless of their current function? Was it institutional inertia? A system of obligations that, once established, could not be dismantled even when their purpose faded? The texts do not distinguish. A royal inscription from the reign of Nabonidus describes his restoration of the Ziggurat in language that blends all three motives. He writes that the ziggurat had become old, that its platform had not been raised for many years, that the god Nana had not ascended to his great place. He describes clearing the ruins of the old temple, excavating down to the foundations laid by Ur-Nammu 1500 years earlier, and rebuilding according to the original plan. The inscription frames this as restoration, a return to the way things were, the way things should be. But the text also implies that Nana had not been present during the centuries of neglect. The god had not ascended. The platform had been empty. Nabonidus rebuilt the temple not because the god was there, but so the god could return. But did Nana return? The ritual texts from the Neo-Babylonian period describe processions to the ziggurat, offerings made, hymns sung. They describe the statue brought up and brought down, but they do not describe the god's response. They do not record divine speech, divine action, divine presence beyond the ritual framework. The god is invoked, honoured, and processed. But the god is not depicted as actor. The ritual continues, but the reciprocal exchange, offering met with blessing, prayer met with response, is no longer part of the record. This is the quiet shift that appears across late Mesopotamian temple administration. The rituals persist with extraordinary continuity. The same festivals are celebrated across centuries, their calendrical dates maintained, their procedures copied into new ritual tablets with meticulous precision. But the rituals become formalized. They are performed because they are the rituals, because this is what is done, because the temple calendar requires it. The rationale, why the ritual is performed, what it accomplishes, what response it generates, is no longer articulated. The ritual simply is. The ziggurats embody this. They are structures built for a purpose that is no longer active, maintained as if the purpose might resume, but functionally serving as monuments to their own persistence. They are not ruins. Ruins are failures, evidence of collapse. The ziggurats are successes. They were built well enough to last millennia, maintained carefully enough to survive. But they are successes at preserving a form whose content has become ambiguous. The platform is there. The temple may or may not be there. The god is honoured. But whether the god is present, in the sense the original builders meant, is something the later texts do not claim. Nabonidus, in his inscriptions, expresses something close to desperation about this. He excavates old foundations, he consults ancient texts, he tries to restore temples exactly as they were originally built. He writes that he is fulfilling the commands of the gods, that the gods have shown him visions, that the gods approve of his restorations. But his inscriptions also reveal doubt. He describes searching for the original foundation deposits, for the inscriptions that would tell him how the temple was meant to be built, because the knowledge had been lost. He is trying to reconstruct not just the buildings, but the knowledge of how the buildings functioned. He is attempting, through archaeology and epigraphy, to restore a relationship with the gods that is no longer self-evident. The ziggurats, in this light, become something other than architecture. They become questions. They are structures that ask whether presence can be maintained through form alone, whether continuity of ritual can substitute for continuity of relationship, whether the gods remain if the temples remain. The cities answered yes by continuing to maintain them, but the maintenance itself suggests uncertainty. If the answer were obvious, the ziggurats would either be inhabited temples or demolished ruins. Instead, they are preserved as possibilities, kept ready just in case, year after year, century after century, long after the last scribe who recorded direct divine instruction had filed his tablet and set down his stylus. What the ziggurats embody is waiting. Not abandonment, not decay, but the preservation of a space for something that is no longer present, but might, perhaps, return. The platforms stand. The staircases lead upward. The surfaces are clean and level, ready to receive what they were built to hold. But what they hold is emptiness, carefully maintained, precisely preserved, as if emptiness itself could be an act of faith, or memory, or obligation. The texts do not say which. Tablet BM 36609, a small clay document excavated from Babylon and now housed in the British Museum, is an astronomical diary fragment dating to the Seleucid period, approximately 274 BCE. It is part of a much larger tradition of cuneiform astronomical records that span nearly 2,000 years, from the Old Babylonian period through the fall of cuneiform literacy in the 1st century CE. The tablet records lunar and planetary observations for a single month, the positions of the moon relative to specific stars, the dates of first and last visibility for Venus and Jupiter, meteorological phenomena including rain and wind direction, market prices for barley and dates, and the level of the Euphrates River. The observations are precise. Venus was last visible in the west on the evening of day 12. Jupiter reached its stationary point on day 21. The moon passed 2 fingers below the star Eta Tauri on day 7. These are not symbolic statements. They are measurements recorded to support prediction. The astronomical diaries were compiled by temple scribes, primarily at the Esagila temple in Babylon, as part of a scribal tradition that treated the sky as text. The same term used for reading cuneiform, amaru, to see, was used for observing the heavens. The sky was something to be read, but unlike terrestrial texts, which could be copied and preserved unchanged, the sky changed nightly. The stars rose and set, the planets moved, the moon waxed and waned. To read the sky required continuous observation, night after night, year after year, generation after generation. The diaries were the archive of this reading, compiled not for immediate use, but for long-term pattern recognition. Why continue this work across centuries? The traditional explanation is astrological. Mesopotamian scholars believed that celestial events were omens, signs of divine will that could be interpreted to predict earthly outcomes. The movements of the planets, the appearance of eclipses, the behavior of the moon, all were thought to communicate divine intentions regarding the king, the land, the harvest, the outcome of wars. The astronomical diaries provided the raw data for this interpretive system. By recording every observable event, the scribes built a database that could be consulted when new omens appeared, to see what had happened the last time Venus did this, or Jupiter aligned with that star, or an eclipse occurred in this month. This explanation is correct as far as it goes. The omen compendia, large collections of celestial omens with their terrestrial interpretations, were copied and transmitted across the same period as the astronomical diaries. Texts like the Enuma Anu Enlil, a 70-tablet compendium of celestial omens, drew on centuries of observational records to correlate sky events with historical outcomes. If Jupiter appeared in a certain position during a certain month, and the king died 3 months later, this correlation was recorded. The next time Jupiter appeared in that position, the omen predicted the king's death. The system required long-term records to function, but the astronomical diaries contain far more information than the omen compendia used. The diaries record planetary positions to a precision of degrees and fractions of degrees. They note the brightness of planets. They record weather, river levels, market prices. Most of this data does not appear in the omen texts. The omens care whether an eclipse occurred, not whether it rained that day. They care whether Mars was visible, not its exact position relative to a star. The diaries record observational detail far beyond what the omen system required. This suggests that the diaries had a second purpose, one that emerged gradually over centuries of observation, pattern recognition for its own sake. The scribes were not only looking for omens, they were looking for regularities, for cycles, for predictable structures in the sky's behavior. By the late Babylonian period, this effort had produced something unprecedented: mathematical astronomy. The scribes had discovered that planetary motion could be modelled numerically. They developed algorithms, arithmetical schemes that predicted future planetary positions without requiring observation. These schemes, recorded in texts called ephemerides, were based on the assumption that celestial phenomena were periodic, that they repeated in cycles, and that those cycles could be calculated. This is extraordinary for several reasons. First, it required centuries of data. The cycles are long. The synodic period of Saturn is 378 days, of Jupiter 399 days. To identify these periods with precision required tracking planets across multiple generations. Second, it required treating the sky as a system, as something governed by rules rather than by arbitrary divine will. If the gods moved the planets according to their immediate intentions, there would be no cycles, no predictability. The very act of developing mathematical models implied that celestial motion was regular, that it followed patterns, that it could be known in advance. But here is the tension. The scribes continued to interpret the sky as omen. They continued to compile omen compendia, to send celestial reports to kings, to frame astronomical events as communications from the gods. The same scribes who developed mathematical astronomy also practiced astrology. They treated the sky as both system and message. They predicted planetary positions using algorithms, then interpreted those positions as divine signs. This dual framework persisted until the end of cuneiform culture. A late text from Uruk, dated to 77 CE, records planetary predictions using ephemeris calculations, then includes a colophon stating that the text was written for the sake of the well-being of the temple of Anu and Antu, and for the life of the scribe. The scribe is using mathematical astronomy to support ritual and divine service. The system is computational, but its purpose remains religious. What this implies is that the Babylonian astronomers did not see mathematics and religion as contradictory. The regularities they discovered in the sky did not replace the gods. Instead, the regularities revealed the gods' method. The sky was still a text written by the gods, but it was a text that followed grammar. The gods communicated through cycles, through patterns, through predictable motion. Understanding the grammar did not eliminate the message. It allowed the message to be read more accurately. But this raises a deeper question. If the gods communicated through cycles that could be calculated, what was left for the gods to do? If planetary motion was predictable, if eclipses could be forecasted years in advance, then the gods were not deciding these events moment by moment. They were not actively choosing when Jupiter would appear or when the moon would be eclipsed. They had, at some point, established the cycles. The scribes were not observing divine will in action. They were observing the persistence of divine order, set in place long ago and continuing automatically. This is not a conclusion the Babylonian scribes explicitly stated, but it is implied by the structure of their work. The ephemerides predict events, the omens interpret events, but the connection between the two becomes strained. If an eclipse can be predicted to the day using arithmetic, and its occurrence is not a spontaneous divine message, it is the result of a long-established pattern. The omen system assumes that celestial events are contingent, that they occur because the gods choose to send them, and that their timing and nature communicate specific intentions. The mathematical system assumes that celestial events are necessary, that they occur because the cycles require them, and that their timing is determined by arithmetic. The scribes tried to maintain both. They used mathematical prediction to know when to watch for omens, to prepare for ritually significant events. But the more accurate the predictions became, the less room remained for divine spontaneity. The sky was still sacred, still divine, but it was no longer responsive in the immediate sense. It was operating according to principles the gods had established, not according to decisions the gods were making. This shift is visible in the language of late astronomical texts. Earlier omen texts describe celestial events as actions. If the moon is eclipsed, if Jupiter stands in, if Venus appears. The subjects are celestial bodies, but the implied agent is divine. The moon is eclipsed because the gods eclipse it. Later astronomical texts describe the same events as states. The moon will be eclipsed. Jupiter's position will be. Venus's first visibility will occur on. The language shifts from active to predictive, from divine action to systemic outcome. But the scribes continued to observe. Every night, for centuries, they climbed to the temple roofs, watched the sky, and recorded what they saw. This was not idle curiosity, it was duty. The astronomical diaries were official temple documents, archived alongside administrative and ritual texts. Observation was part of the temple's function, as essential as maintaining the cult statues or performing the festivals. But why? If the sky's behavior could be predicted, why continue to watch? One answer is verification. The mathematical models were accurate, but not perfect. Discrepancies occurred. The planets occasionally appeared earlier or later than predicted. Observation ensured that the models remained calibrated to reality. This is practical and scientifically sound, but it does not explain the ritual context. The astronomical diaries were not purely scientific instruments. They were temple records, compiled by priests, stored in sacred archives. The observation of the sky was not separate from religious practice. It was religious practice. This suggests that observation itself had become a form of devotion. The scribes were not watching the sky to gather data. They were watching because watching was what their predecessors had done, because the tradition required it, because the act of observation maintained a relationship with the divine order, even if the gods themselves were not actively intervening. The sky was still sacred, the patterns were still divine, but the divinity had become impersonal. The gods were present in the structure, not in the event. The astronomical diaries, in this light, become records of something other than astronomy. They become records of continuity, of a tradition that persisted across the collapse of empires, the replacement of dynasties, the shift from Akkadian to Aramaic as spoken language. The scribes continued to write in cuneiform long after cuneiform had ceased to be used for ordinary purposes. They continued to observe the sky long after the omen system had lost political relevance. They continued because the tradition itself had become the message. The sky was observed not because it was changing, but because it was not changing. The cycles persisted, the patterns held, and by recording them, the scribes participated in that persistence. The last astronomical diary dates to 61 CE. After that, silence. The tradition did not end because the sky stopped being interesting. It ended because the scribal culture that sustained it collapsed. Cuneiform literacy was lost. The temples were closed or repurposed. The astronomers died, and no new generation was trained to replace them. The sky continued its cycles, unobserved, unrecorded. The patterns persisted, but there was no one left to read them. What the astronomical diaries preserve is the longest continuous scientific tradition in human history. Nearly 2,000 years of nightly observation, recorded in clay, archived in temples, transmitted from master to student across generations. But they also preserve something quieter. The effort to maintain a relationship with the divine through observation, through record-keeping, through the discipline of watching even when the gods no longer spoke, even when the patterns were predictable, even when the only thing left to discover was that the cycles would continue. The scribes watched the sky because the sky was there to be watched, because their teachers had taught them to watch, because the tradition required it. They recorded what they saw because recording was the act that connected them to the order the gods had established, an order that persisted long after the gods had receded from active governance. The sky remained. The scribes recorded it. And in that recording, something, perhaps knowledge, perhaps memory, perhaps obligation, was preserved. Tablet MS 3874, held in the Shoyan collection, is a mathematical exercise text from the Old Babylonian period, approximately 1800 BCE. It is a small, square tablet, typical of the scribal school curriculum, inscribed with a single problem and its solution. The problem asks, if a man digs a trench 5 GAR long, 1 GAR wide, and 1 GAR deep, and each worker digs 10 GAR per day, how many workers are needed to complete the trench in one day? The solution is worked out step by step. First, the volume is calculated. 5 GAR times 1 GAR times 1 GAR equals 5 GAR threbe. Then the volume is converted to smaller units. 5 GAR threbed equals 5 times 12 threbed equals 8,640 GIN threbed. The work rate is given. 10 GIN threbed per worker per day. Division. 8,640 divided by 10 equals 864 workers. The answer is recorded. 864 men are needed. The tablet then ends with the scribe's colophon. Hand of Ili Idinum, son of Manum Balam Marduk, scribe. This is a student exercise. Ili Idinum was learning mathematics, and this tablet is evidence of his training. But what is extraordinary is not the problem itself, practical arithmetic of the kind any construction foreman might use, but the fact that this problem, and thousands like it, were part of a standardized curriculum that persisted across centuries with almost no variation. The same problem types appear in tablets from Nippur, Ur, Sippar, Mari, Susa, cities separated by hundreds of kilometers, governed by different dynasties, speaking different dialects. The mathematical curriculum was remarkably uniform. The problems involved the same units, the same methods, the same structures. Students learned to calculate areas and volumes, to solve linear and quadratic equations, to work with reciprocal tables and multiplication tables. They learned a mathematical system that was not invented during their lifetime, not even during their teacher's lifetime. It was inherited. The Mesopotamian number system was sexagesimal, base 60. The same system underlies modern timekeeping, 60 seconds, 60 minutes, and angular measurement, 360 degrees. But its origin is obscure. By the time mathematical texts appear in the Old Babylonian period, the system is already fully developed, standardized, and used across all administrative, commercial, and scholarly contexts. No text explains why base 60 was chosen. No text describes the system's invention. It simply exists, as if it had always existed. The metrological system, the units for length, area, volume, weight, was equally standardized. The basic unit of length was the GAR, approximately 6 meters. 1 GAR was subdivided into 12 cubits, each cubit into 30 fingers. Area was measured in SAR, with 1 SAR equals 1 GAR squared. Volume was measured in GAR threbed for earth-moving, in SILA for liquids and dry goods. Weight was measured in mina and shekel, with 1 mina equals 60 shekel. These units were not approximate, they were precise. Standard weights and measures have been excavated from multiple sites, and they match to within a few percent. The system was maintained across political boundaries, across linguistic shifts, across the rise and fall of dynasties. Why did the system persist? One answer is practical necessity. Commerce requires standardized measures. A sealer of grain in needed to equal a sealer in Uruk, or trade would collapse into confusion. Administrative record-keeping required consistent units, or the archives would be incomparable across years. The system persisted because it was useful, because abandoning it would have imposed enormous costs. But this does not explain why the system never changed. Measures are conventions. They can be redefined. The French Revolution replaced traditional measures with the metric system. The British Empire standardized imperial units. Political powers routinely imposed new systems as assertions of authority. But Mesopotamian measures remained stable from the Sumerian early dynastic period through the Neo-Babylonian period, more than 2,500 years. Kings conquered cities, imposed new laws, replaced old gods with new ones, but they did not change the GAR or the SILA. The measures persisted as if they were not conventions, but facts. The mathematical texts treat them this way. Problems never define the units. They assume the student knows what a GAR is, what a SILA is, how to convert between them. The system is taught as given, as inherent to the world. No text asks why there are 60 shekels in a mina or why there are 12 cubits in a GAR. The system simply is. This is unusual. Most ancient measurement systems were anthropometric, based on human body parts, variable and approximate. The Egyptian cubit was the length of a forearm. The Roman foot was, originally, the length of a foot. These units varied by region and over time because they were tied to human dimensions which vary. But Mesopotamian units, while named after body parts, the cubit, the finger, were standardized beyond human variation. They were maintained by official standards, physical objects kept in temples and administrative centers used to calibrate the measures used in markets and workshops. The system was no longer anthropometric. It had been fixed, abstracted from the body, made into something independent of human measurement. This abstraction implies origin. At some point, the system was designed. Someone chose base 60. Someone defined the GAR, subdivided it into cubits and fingers, established the relationships between length, area, and volume. Someone created the multiplication tables, the reciprocal tables, the coefficient lists that scribes used to perform calculations. But no text records this creation. The mathematical tradition treats its own foundations as timeless. The reciprocal tables are particularly striking. A reciprocal table lists numbers and their reciprocals, the number that, when multiplied by the original, equals 1. In sexagesimal arithmetic, the reciprocal of 2 is 30, because 2 times 30 equals 60, which is 1 in base 60. The reciprocal of 3 is 20. The reciprocal of 4 is 15. These tables were essential for division, which Mesopotamian scribes performed by multiplying by the reciprocal. But the tables only list numbers whose reciprocals are finite in base 60, numbers that are products of 2, 3, and 5. Numbers like 7, 11, 13, whose reciprocals are infinite repeating sexagesimals, are omitted. This is not an error, it is a choice. The system was designed to avoid non-terminating divisions. This level of design implies sophistication. Whoever created the system understood its mathematical structure deeply enough to recognize which numbers would cause problems and to exclude them. This is not trial and error, it is systematic planning. But by the Old Babylonian period, this planning was long forgotten. The scribes used the tables but did not explain them. They avoided dividing by 7 but did not articulate why. The system was taught as procedure, not as theory. The same is true of the mathematical methods. Mesopotamian scribes could solve quadratic equations, problems of the form x squared plus bx equals c. They had standard procedures, algorithmic steps that always worked. But they did not have algebraic notation. They did not express the solution as a formula. They solve each problem numerically, step by step, recording each intermediate result. The procedure was the knowledge. The scribes knew how to solve the problem, but they did not, as far as the tablets reveal, know why the procedure worked. They had inherited the method without inheriting the explanation. This raises a central question. What happens to knowledge when it is transmitted as procedure without theory? The scribes could perform calculations that required sophisticated mathematical insight, but they performed them mechanically, following steps they had memorized. They could calculate the area of irregular fields by decomposing them into triangles and trapezoids, then summing the parts. They could solve cubic equations by reduction to quadratics. They could approximate square roots using iterative methods. All of this appears in the tablets, but none of it is explained. The tablets show the calculation. They do not show the reasoning that generated the calculation. This is not illiteracy or ignorance. It is a different epistemological stance. The scribes valued correct procedure over theoretical understanding. They transmitted methods that worked, and they verified that those methods worked by using them again and again across generations. The curriculum ensured that each new scribe learned the same procedures their teachers had learned. Accuracy was maintained by repetition, by adherence to tradition, by faithful copying of the standard problem sets. But this also meant that the knowledge could not evolve. If the scribes did not understand why the methods worked, they could not adapt them to new problems. They could solve the problems in the curriculum, but they could not generalize. The mathematical tradition became conservative, preserving what had been inherited, but generating little that was new. The same problem types appear in tablets from 1800 BCE and 1600 BCE, nearly identical in structure and method. The tradition was stable because it was reproductive, not innovative. Yet it persisted. For more than a millennium, scribes learned mathematics not because it was changing or because new discoveries were being made, but because it was part of what scribes did. Mathematics was embedded in the scribal identity, part of the curriculum that defined literacy. To be a scribe was to know how to calculate areas, to maintain accounts, to solve the standard problems. The knowledge was professional rather than intellectual. It was a craft, learned by apprenticeship, transmitted through repetition. But the craft claimed ancient origins. The scribes attributed their knowledge to the distant past, to the time before the flood, to the sages who had lived at the beginning of time. A late Babylonian text, the so-called Catalogue of Sages, lists 7 antediluvian sages, called Apkallu, who brought knowledge to humanity. The list includes Adapa, Yuan, and others, described as advisors to the antediluvian kings, the ones who taught the arts of civilization: writing, mathematics, divination, ritual. The catalogue frames knowledge as something revealed, given by semi-divine figures at the beginning of history, and then preserved by human transmission. This is not a claim the scribes could verify. The antediluvian sages were mythic figures, their existence asserted by tradition, not by evidence. But the claim served a function. It grounded the scribal curriculum in divine origins. It made the knowledge sacred, not in the sense of religious content, but in the sense of unchangeable inheritance. The scribes were not creating mathematics, they were preserving it. Their role was not to innovate, but to maintain, to ensure that the methods passed down from the Apkallu were transmitted intact to the next generation. This is a profoundly conservative epistemology. It values continuity over discovery, transmission over invention, fidelity over adaptation. And in the Mesopotamian context, it worked. The mathematical tradition persisted for more than 2 millennia, longer than any other mathematical culture in the ancient world. The methods remained accurate, the tables remained correct, the system functioned. But what was lost in this persistence? The scribes inherited powerful mathematical methods, but they inherited them as black boxes, procedures that worked but whose internal logic was opaque. They could use the methods but could not interrogate them, could not extend them, could not adapt them to problems outside the traditional curriculum. The knowledge was preserved, but it was also frozen. The tradition ensured survival, but at the cost of stagnation. By the Seleucid period, the scribal curriculum still included mathematics. Tablets from Uruk and Babylon show students solving the same problems their predecessors had solved 1,500 years earlier. But the world around them had changed. Greek mathematics, with its emphasis on proof and generalization, had developed new methods. The scribes continued to use sexagesimal arithmetic, continued to solve quadratic equations by ancient procedures, continued to teach the reciprocal tables. They were still accurate, but they were no longer advancing. The last cuneiform mathematical tablet dates to the 1st century CE. After that, the tradition ended. The scribal schools closed. The knowledge was not lost, it was translated into Greek, into Arabic, eventually into modern forms. But the tradition itself, the unbroken line of transmission from teacher to student across millennia, was severed. The methods persisted, but the culture that had preserved them did not. What the mathematical tablets reveal is a civilization that understood knowledge as inheritance. The scribes did not see themselves as creators, they saw themselves as custodians, responsible for maintaining what had been given to them by the ancients, by the Apkallu, by the gods. This is not passivity. It is a different form of agency, one that values preservation over innovation, continuity over novelty. The scribes maintained the system. They taught it to their students. They ensured it remained accurate across centuries, but they did not ask where it came from, or why it worked, or what else might be possible. They accepted it as given, as part of the order of things, as knowledge that was not theirs to alter. And in accepting it, they preserved it. For 2,000 years, the numbers remained constant, the methods remained reliable, the tradition remained unbroken, until it ended. But the numbers themselves, the base 60, the GAR and the Sela, the reciprocal tables, remain, embedded in modern systems of time and angle, silent traces of a knowledge that was, once, considered divine. Tablet L2, excavated from Lagash in 1878, and now in the collections of the Istanbul Archaeological Museums, is a legal document from the reign of Urukagina, ruler of Lagash, around 2350 BCE. The tablet is a land sale contract, recording the transfer of a field measuring 3 GAN from a seller named Amargarid to a buyer named Enentazi. The transaction is standard. The field's size and location are specified, the price is listed, 4 shekels of silver, and the payment is confirmed. But the final clause of the contract is unusual. It states, "By Ningirsu and by Nanshe, Amargarid swore." 2 gods are named as witnesses to the oath. Not metaphorically. The text does not say, "in the name of," or "invoking." It says the seller swore by the gods, implying the gods were present as parties to the transaction, as guarantors whose authority made the contract binding. This formula appears across early dynastic legal texts. Oaths invoke gods. Sales, loans, and disputes are recorded as occurring before named deities. The gods are positioned as juridical authorities, as the ones who enforce the contract. But the nature of this enforcement is not specified. The texts do not describe what happens if the oath is broken. They do not say the gods will punish the violator, or that the gods will intervene to ensure compliance. They simply record that the oath was sworn before the gods, and this is treated as sufficient. By the Ur-3 period, the legal language has shifted. Contracts still invoke gods, but the invocation moves from the operative clause to the colophon. The transaction is recorded in purely human terms: buyer, seller, price, witnesses, and then, in the final line, a brief formula: by the life of the king and by Nana. The oath is no longer sworn before the god as witness. It is sworn in the god's name, as a formula, as a closing phrase. The god has moved from participant to invocation, from juridical presence to symbolic reference. By the Old Babylonian period, even this formula is becoming rare. The law code of Hammurabi, inscribed around 1750 BCE, invokes the gods extensively in its prologue and epilogue. Hammurabi describes himself as chosen by the gods, commanded by Marduk to establish justice, acting as the shepherd of the people under divine authority. But the laws themselves, the 282 case rulings that form the body of the code, do not invoke gods. They state conditions and consequences. If a man strikes another man's daughter and causes her to miscarry, he shall pay 10 shekels of silver. No god is named. No oath is required. The law operates as a human institution, with human judges, human penalties, human enforcement. This does not mean the gods were absent from legal thought. The prologue and epilogue frame the entire code as divinely sanctioned. Hammurabi claims he is enacting justice as commanded by the gods, that the laws reflect divine will, that violating them offends the gods. But the mechanism of enforcement has changed. The gods do not punish the offender directly. The state punishes the offender, and the state claims to act in accordance with divine command. The gods authorize the system, but they do not operate it. This is a subtle but fundamental shift. In the early dynastic texts, the gods were juridical actors. Oaths were sworn before them, disputes were resolved in their presence, contracts were guaranteed by their authority. The gods were the enforcers, the ones whose power made the law binding. By the Old Babylonian period, the gods were juridical sources. They had, at some earlier time, established the principles of justice. The king's role was to enact those principles, to codify them, to administer them. But the administration was human. The judges were human. The penalties were human. The gods remained as the origin of the system, but they were no longer its operators. The clearest evidence of this shift is in the language of legal oaths. Early texts describe oaths as speech acts performed in the presence of the god. The oath is a direct transaction. The speaker addresses the god witnesses the oath, the god's authority binds the oath. Later texts describe oaths as invocations. The oath calls upon the god's name, but the god is not depicted as present. The formula, by the life of the king and by Nama, is a rhetorical frame, not a depiction of divine attendance. The god's name lends authority, but the god's presence is not claimed. By the late 2nd millennium, legal texts often omit divine references entirely. Neo-Assyrian contracts, for example, frequently list human witnesses, sometimes a dozen or more, but no gods. The authority of the contract derives from the witnesses, from the seal impressions, from the archive where the tablet is filed. The system has become entirely human in its operation, even if its ultimate legitimation remains divine in theory. But this raises a problem. If the gods no longer enforce oaths, why should anyone keep them? The early dynastic answer was straightforward. The gods would know if the oath was broken, and divine punishment would follow. But if the gods were no longer active enforcers, if punishment was left to human institutions, then the oath became a legal rather than a religious mechanism. Its power derived not from the fear of divine retribution, but from the threat of human consequences, fines, imprisonment, social sanctions. This is the transition from sacred to secular law. The law retains its claim to divine origins, but its function becomes independent of divine action. The gods authorized justice, but humans administered it. The question is whether the people who lived under this system experienced it as continuity or as abandonment. Did they believe the gods still cared about oaths, or did they believe the gods had delegated enforcement to human institutions? The texts do not say. They record the laws, the oaths, the punishments. They invoke the gods in formulaic ways, but they do not articulate what the god's role is supposed to be, beyond having established the system in the first place. The Middle Assyrian laws, compiled around 1100 BCE, illustrate this ambiguity. The laws are detailed, specific, and brutal. They prescribe physical punishments for a wide range of offences, cutting off noses, ears, fingers, blinding, impalement. The laws are presented as royal decrees, issued by the king, enforced by the king's officials. But the prologue claims the laws are in accordance with the word of the god Ashur, the chief deity of Assyria. The god is the source, but the king is the legislator. The laws are divine in origin, but human in application. What this means in practice is that the laws could be changed. Kings issued new laws, amended old ones, adjusted penalties. The law codes were not scripture. They were administrative instruments, adaptable to the needs of the state. But this adaptability created a tension. If the laws were divinely ordained, how could they be changed? If they were human creations, why invoke the gods at all? The texts resolve this tension by claiming that the gods established principles, not specific rules. Justice, truth, order, these were divine. The specific application of these principles to particular cases was human. The king's role was to interpret divine will, to apply divine principles to the circumstances of his reign. This gave the law both authority and flexibility. It was divine, but it was not fixed. It was revealed, but it required human interpretation. But this also meant that the gods could not be consulted. If a case was ambiguous, if a law was unclear, the judge could not ask the god for clarification. The judge had to decide based on precedent, based on the written code, based on the king's instructions. The gods had spoken, but they had spoken in the past. Their voice was preserved in the law, but it was not available for new questions. This is the nature of inherited divine authority. The gods established the system, then withdrew from its operation. The system continued, claiming divine origins, but functioning autonomously. The laws were still called the word of the god, but the words were interpreted by humans, applied by humans, enforced by humans. The gods were the authors, but the text was now in human hands. Late Babylonian legal texts show this process taken to its conclusion. A contract from the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II records a loan, 40 shekels of silver, to be repaid with interest, witnessed by 6 named individuals, sealed by the lender and borrower. No god is invoked, no oath is sworn. The contract is purely transactional. The authority derives from the witnesses, from the seals, from the legal system that recognizes such documents as binding. The gods are absent. But the same society that produced these secular contracts also maintained elaborate temple legal systems. The temples owned vast estates, employed thousands of people, entered into contracts, collected rents, resolved disputes. Temple courts operated alongside royal courts, adjudicating cases involving temple property, temple personnel, temple obligations. These temple courts invoked the gods extensively. Cases were resolved according to the law of the Temple of Marduk, or in the presence of the god Shamash. The gods remained juridical authorities within the temple context, even as they receded from secular law. This suggests that the legal system bifurcated. Secular transactions, commerce, loans, land sales, operated under human authority. Sacred transactions, temple dues, priestly obligations, ritual purity, operated under divine authority. The gods had not withdrawn entirely. They had withdrawn from certain domains, leaving those domains to human administration while retaining authority over others. But this bifurcation was unstable. Temple courts had no enforcement power beyond the temple community. If a secular authority chose not to recognize a temple court's ruling, the temple could do little. The god's authority was real within the temple, but outside the temple, it was contingent on secular recognition. The system worked as long as secular rulers chose to respect temple authority, but that respect was a political choice, not a divine mandate. By the Seleucid period, temple legal authority was in decline. Greek and later Parthian rulers recognized temple property rights, but did not defer to temple courts on broader legal matters. The temples continued to function, to own land, to employ priests, but their juridical independence eroded. The gods were still honored, still invoked, but their legal authority was subordinate to the state. What this trajectory reveals is not the death of divine law, but its transformation. The gods did not cease to be sources of justice. They ceased to be enforcers of justice. The laws continued to claim divine origins, but the mechanisms of enforcement became human. Judges, officials, witnesses, archives. These were the instruments that made law binding, not divine intervention. The gods remained in the prologue, in the oath formulas, in the rhetoric of justice. But the operation of the system no longer required them. This is what the legal texts mean when they invoke gods who do not act. The gods are present as legitimation, as origin, as the reason why justice matters. But they are not present as agents. The law functions without them, day by day, case by case, fine by fine. The scribes record the laws, the judges apply them, the penalties are enforced. And the gods, somewhere in the background, are remembered as the ones who first said that justice was necessary. But whether they still care, whether they still watch, whether they would intervene if the system failed, the texts do not say. They record the law as it is practiced, and the gods as they are invoked. The connection between the two, once immediate, has become historical. The gods gave the law, humans maintain it, and that maintenance, Year after year, century after century, is the only continuity the texts preserve.